The Havighurst Center for Russian and Post-Soviet Studies turns 20 years old this academic year. The first conference we convened was held in Oxford, Ohio in March 2001 on the theme of Imagining Russia. A number of prominent scholars came to campus to talk about the state of the field being broadly imagined and inclusive at that time. We thought we'd use our 20th anniversary in 2020 to reimagine what we know. One of the first guests at that first conference was then Professor of Political Science at Stanford, Michael McFaul, a noted scholar of Russian politics who had just finished his book, Russia's Unfinished Revolution, Political Change from Gorbachev to Putin, which came out with Cornell University Press in 2001. McFaul, of course, would go on to serve as United States ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014, experiences he captures in his recent book, From Cold War to Hot Peace. Now, Dr. McFaul is again a professor of political science at Stanford, the Ken Olivier and Angela Nominelli Professor in International Studies in the Department of Political Science, where he is also the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and the Peter and Helen Bing Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. He joins us as our first guest in this new series, Reimagining Russia. Thank you for joining us again.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a real honor. And I do remember that first conference and Professor Karen DeWisha, who invited me, a fantastic scholar who we all dearly miss. So it's an honor to be here, in some way to honor her.
And that's a nice segue to, I appreciate that, nice segue to my first question, which is to start with Putin and Putinism. When you first visited and when you wrote Russia's Unfinished Revolution, Vladimir Putin had been president for just about a year. And at that time, he was still something of an unknown, the man without a face, as Masha Gessen would later describe him. And at the time of our first conference and in the immediate years after, scholars debated whether Putin and the system he was establishing could be described as a hybrid one, a managed democracy was a term used a lot at that time, or some form of soft authoritarianism. And in fact, in 2008, you even wrote a foreign affairs article on the myth of the authoritarian model about Putin. So we've now had Putin and Putinism for 20 years, ironically, the life of the Havighurst Center. So in your view, what best defines it and how has it evolved over the years?
Well, it's interesting to remember those early debates. I'm glad you brought them up because I did finish writing that book, like you said, which is basically about the Gorbachev and Yeltsin eras, right? So the book starts in '85 and basically ends right when Putin came to power. And I end it with a question mark about will these democratic institutions survive? I had one chapter describing that it meets the definition of electoral democracy, which is that there are rules of the game that allow for the leaders to be elected, and we don't know the outcome of those elections. So that meets the very basic minimum. But then I had a separate chapter saying all the reasons it didn't meet the higher standard of liberal democracy, as Larry Diamond used to call it, or consolidated democracy. And I was nervous that Putin was going to come to power and destroy electoral democracy. In fact, I wrote my first piece about Putin and his views. It was called Indifferent to Democracy in March of 2000, even before he was president. He was president-elect at the time. And I said there were some troubling signs about his commitment to these political institutions. And I think in retrospect, we underestimated how committed he was to undermining them. And I would also say, because I know many of the people and interest groups and political actors from that period, they also, Russians, underestimated how quickly he would be able to undermine the political institutions, the weakly consolidated democratic institutions at the time. But he did. And I think today there's no argument, in my view, among scholars I know, that Russia is an autocracy. It meets the basic definitions it has for a long time. Now, which adjective you put in front of that, we can argue about. It's soft authoritarian, semi-autocracy, and that's a debate worth having. But the basic minimum of a definition, I like the one that Adam Jaworski wrote many decades ago, is that the rules of the game are set. Nobody gets to change who wins the outcome afterwards. So there's no veto player afterwards. And there's some uncertainty sometime about who wins the election. And that basic minimalist definition is no longer valid for Russia today. We've had several elections, including one not too long ago, and everybody knew who was going to win. Tragically, Russia is no longer a democracy.
Do you think Putin, and maybe even Putinism is the better term here, do you think it's evolved significantly over time? There's a debate about how much of what Putinism is now was present at the beginning. I'm thinking here also of McFaul Zieger's book. Zieger was out at our campus a couple years ago, where his argument is that it has evolved, and you can trace certain evolutions in the pattern of Putinism to the point where it has arrived at the moment you just described it as. Do you accept that view, or do you think there were things present from the beginning that we just missed?
Well, it's a great question, great way to frame it. And by the way, I like your invoking of Putinism. I think we need to talk more about ideology. I know some scholars think he has no ideology. I disagree with that. But I tend to, if there's a debate about was it always this way or evolution, I leaned in the Zieger camp, but not uniformly. I think you need to break it down into three different buckets. So on the political side, I think it was pretty clear from the get-go that he was going to try to reduce constraints on his political power. So whether that's autocracy, democracy, doesn't matter. But right away from the get-go, he went after independent media, for instance, NTV. He took over ORT, the first channel, because he knew that that was an independent source of political power. He wanted to control that. And so with respect to democracy, I think he's been clear. Now, I met Putin a long time ago, by the way. I met him first in 1991, ironically, there to do a democracy promotion seminar with a group called the National Democratic Institute. And he was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg at the time, so he was our host. And I would just note that back then, he could have signed up with Zhirinovsky and the neo-nationalists, or he could have signed up with Zyuganov and the neo-communists. He didn't. He spent his 90s tethered to the Democrats, right? To the liberal Democrats, Anatoly Sobchak in St. Petersburg, and later Boris Yeltsin. But I think that's an indicative of his opportunism, not his ideological commitment to democracy. But in the other two spheres, I think there was more of an evolution. So on economic policy, if you go back to the early 2000s, Vladimir Putin instituted what we would call, if we were in Europe, many liberal reforms, what we would call, if we're at the Hoover Institution, where I work, conservative reforms. But most certainly there were market-friendly reforms, like the flat tax for individual income, 13%, one of the lowest in the world. He reduced the corporate tax. He had very tight financial and macroeconomic policies. And in those early years, he was friendly to the markets, and I would say friendly to foreign investment. Over the decades, over the 2 decades, he's become less friendly to the market. The state has become a bigger part of the economy, and he's most certainly become less friendly to outsiders in terms of their role in the economy. And then third bucket on foreign policy, I also think there's been an evolution. I think in the beginning, he was open to the idea that they might get along with the West. Of course, he was suspicious of the West because of his KGB background, blaming us for bringing down the Soviet Union. I personally have heard him give that lecture to my former bosses in the government. But when he initially came in, he had an idea that we might cooperate, even floated the idea that Russia could join NATO, by the way, in February of 2000. And then there was September 11th, 2001, which created this moment for a couple of years where Putin thought that he and the United States and his friend, George W. Bush, and they do have still a friendly relationship to this day, could cooperate against a common enemy, global terrorism. That began to erode first with the US war in Iraq in 2003, but I think really the pivotal moment in terms of Putin's views towards the West was the so-called color revolution in Georgia 2003, and then Ukraine 2004, when Putin decided that we were out to overthrow regimes we don't like. And by the way, let's be honest, there's a lot of empirical data to support that hypothesis about American foreign policy over the decades. So he had reason to be suspicious that we might want to support democratic movements in different places. He grossly exaggerated our involvement in those two countries, Georgia and Ukraine, but he never got over that. And so subsequently, you know, when I was in the government, I saw it up close. You know, his view of the Arab Spring was that the United States had sponsored that. And then most detrimentally to US-Russian relations, he blamed us. He blamed the United States. He blamed Obama. He blamed me personally for the political mobilization against his regime in Russia in 2000, 2012. And that fundamental suspicion about the United States and that we advance democracy and human rights around the world, that's where he is today, 20 years later. And the flip side of that is also a new evolutionary piece that I don't think gets enough attention about Putin. And that is, I think over the years, he's become much more conservative, and I say that with a small c, more orthodox, more nationalistic, more anti-multilateral, more anti-liberal. You know, he considers himself to be one of the leaders of the illiberal movement in the world. He said that very directly for many years. And for a long time, he was focused mostly on squeezing out liberal ideas within Russia. And then about a decade ago, he started investing in propagating those ideas abroad, primarily in Europe. But today, he has a lot of allies. So he has some are in power in Hungary, Viktor Orban, Salvini in Italy. Many would argue, I would argue that he has a lot of ideological affinity with the current president of the United States. And that is something also new that you would not have found traces of that if you were looking at Putin's worldview back in 1999 or 2000.
That's a good segue to another question. But and by the way, what you know, when I write about contemporary Russia, I write about film and cultural policy and historical memory, and I see an evolution there too. That is, in the first part of Putin's presidency, when McFaul was the cultural minister, policies were relatively benign. There weren't parameters put on what movies you could make and how you got state support. And that changed significantly in 2012 when Medinsky was named cultural ministry, or
Yes.
minister of culture, and there were a lot of strings attached to certain things. But
that's really interesting to me. I need to read those. Please send me your work. But that, you know, that is a parallel world. I know both those gentlemen you just mentioned. I used to work with them in the government, and Shvidkoy is a much more cultured person, I would say, than Mr. Medinsky. I'm trying to be diplomatic here, but I've heard people say that. But that you have documented it. That's very striking to me. That suggests that there is an ideological component to this that I think Western observers need to pay more attention to.
State funding can be received only if you follow certain parameters, and you can still make a film and release it. You're just not going to have the state funding. But the question is related to what you pointed out about U.S.-Russian relations. And my colleague Hannah Chapman in political science and her students in Russian foreign policy have written a couple questions, and one of them is appropriate right now. And you just mentioned a couple moments when U.S.-Russian relations were relatively positive. But then, particularly after 2012, things changed when you were there and the way the U.S. was viewed. So the question they want to know, the students, is what are the prospects then for Russian-U.S. relations going forward? Are there any chances of a return to more positive relations, or are we sort of stuck in this version of Putinism as long as Putin is in power?
Well, first, I want to underscore the historical point that you just alluded to, which is that there has not been over the last 30 years continuity in U.S.-Soviet or U.S.-Russian relations. And I think we make a big mistake when we assume, because of Russian culture or history or the balance of power in the international system, that we're destined to be in a confrontational relationship with Russia. That is not my view. Both from my scholarly work, but also my work as a diplomat. And before I was the ambassador, I worked 3 years at the National Security Council for President Obama, 2009 to 2012. And that period was a period of a lot of cooperation between the United States and Russia. I think a lot of Americans have forgotten that. And we called it the reset. Perezagruska for our Russian speakers. Notice I said Perezagruska, not Peragruska. That's an inside joke for the Russian speakers. But it was based on a simple set of ideas that we developed in the transition period And then when when I showed up to work in January 2009, which was to say, we're not going to cooperate with Russia on everything. Back then, we had a giant disagreement with them about their intervention in Georgia in 2008. So we're not gonna agree about where the borders of the state of Georgia are, or who's at fault for what happened in that war in August 2008. But what we're going to do instead is we're not going to allow our disagreements to stop cooperation on all spheres. That was number one, so no linkage. And number two, we're going to look for win-win outcomes where we think it's in Russia's interest and our interests. And number three, we're not going to check our values at the door. We're not going to just talk about the things that the government wanted to. And in particular, Obama had this view that we're going to engage with the government and Russian society at the same time. And for a while, that strategy worked. For about 4 years, it worked because then the president was President Medvedev. And Medvedev embraced the same set of ideas. I think he thought of himself as a westernizer and as a modernizer, different than Putin. And these two gentlemen are not the same. I used to meet with them, on one day we'd see one guy and the next day we'd say the other, and they have very different worldviews. During that period, we did some things that I think were good for America. We signed the New START Treaty, getting rid of 30% of the nuclear weapons in the world. We got sanctions, multilateral sanctions on Iran, which was a predicate for the Iran nuclear deal. I think that made Americans better off. We developed a supply route through Russia to Afghanistan to help our war effort there. We got Russia into the World Trade Organization. And all the while we did that without checking our values at the door. In fact, I get blamed a lot as the ambassador that, I was sent to Moscow to foment revolution against Putin, right? I was literally just on Echo Moskvy, a radio station 10 days ago or so, and they jokingly said, Mr. Color Revolution is back with us. And then I said, guys, don't joke like that. I wasn't sent there. And they said, no matter how hard you try, McFaul, that'll be your nickname here in Russia for the rest of your time. But we were not doing that, but we were engaging with civil society and opposition. And when Barack Obama went to Russia in 2009, he met with civil society leaders, business leaders, students, and even the opposition. And it worked. Nobody thought we were fomenting revolution back then. What changed was two things that came together. One I already mentioned. There was an election in a parliamentary election in December. It was stolen, and there was massive mobilization against that stolen election, not unlike what we're seeing in Belarus today. We did not have anything to do with that, or barely anything to do with that. Russians did that, but Putin blamed us for that. He was in a very paranoid moment right then. And then he came back, right? So he ran for re-election in the spring of 2012. And the combination of that, Putin back in the Kremlin and in this more paranoid spirit, that made cooperation on anything serious impossible. Punctuated again 2 years later by another massive demonstration in Ukraine in the fall, and then in January and February. And again, he thought that we were the ones behind it. He didn't believe that Ukrainians could do that. And when the government fell there, that's when he decided to annex Crimea and invade Ukraine. And, basically since that event, we've been locked in this confrontation ever since. And I'm not optimistic that a new administration could change things. I mean, President Trump has tried. He's embraced Vladimir Putin. He doesn't talk about democracy. He doesn't care about annexation. And yet, 4 years in, he hasn't changed this basic confrontational dynamic. So I think as long as Putin's around, we're probably going to be in the more or less in this confrontational era. But I would say a couple of things. One, we got to make sure we don't allow things to get worse. And I'm nervous about the lack of communication and diplomatic interaction we have with Russia today. The worst thing in the world is military conflict based on misperception or bad information. And that is going up, not down. And then number two, in some areas, we should cooperate when we can. I, for instance, think we need to extend the New START Treaty. It's expiring next year, and I think it would be very prudent to extend it for 5 years. And then there's a whole set of issues that I think we have to re-engage in multilateral settings where Russia has a voice to pursue our common international interests, right? So here I'm thinking of pandemics, here I'm thinking of climate change, here I'm thinking of non-proliferation. In all of those spheres, we should look for ways to cooperate with Russia and China, by the way, I would add them, in those multilateral settings. And then the last thing I would say is I'm deeply disappointed in how we've contracted the connective tissues between our two societies right now. Fewer exchanges, just less and less and less of that. I think that's a big mistake. I would like to see more effort, just in the interest of education, right? I think it's dangerous when we don't have Americans understanding Russians, and I think it's dangerous when Russians don't understand Americans. Notice I said Russians and Americans. I didn't say Russia and the United States.
Yeah, well said. Also, a great nod to earlier learning the Russian language and spending time in Russia as a way of
absolutely
understanding Russians better. Something you were known for, and something my colleagues will appreciate that shout out. You did mention.
And congratulations to what you're doing there. You have one of the most important centers in the country right now doing that. And I just because we're talking on the 20th anniversary, there is nothing more important than language, culture, history. When I came back from government, I spent 5 years in the government, kind of important times, and had a lot of interaction with the president and U.S. ambassador to Russia. And people asked me, well, what were the most important tools you brought from academia to policy? And without question, hands down, knowing the Russian language and knowing history were so much more important than any other thing. And part of it is just because, being an ambassador and speaking Russian makes a big impression on people. And I most certainly was a very outspoken public figure in a way that, and I use Twitter in Russian and TV and radio. But the second thing that I think a lot of people don't understand is, well, and this may be just sui generis, right? This may just be my boss. But I had a boss who also understood, appreciated knowledge and history and culture, Barack Obama. And so he wanted his experts to be in the room when he was making big decisions. And in fact, I can even show you, look right there. That's to remind me of those great days. Actually, 2 photos. One where I'm briefing the president, where he's literally talking to Medvedev on the phone, and there's a garble in the translation. And so I am telling him, what they got wrong, helping him in real time. You can't do that if you don't speak Russian. And the other photo up there, you probably can't see it. That's with our first meeting with Putin out at his dacha. And I was in the room. You get to be in the room, at least with President Obama, if you have that expertise. And so any chance I get, I want to do a shout out to people that learn languages. I don't care which language, but our country desperately needs that kind of expertise.
I'm going to share that a lot and appreciate that. Yeah, you win the background photo. I have covers of my books behind me. Your photos in the Oval Office are better. But part of what you were known for in Russia, and part of what you referenced earlier, was your interest in civil society and your awareness of opposition in Russia. So, of course, what's in the news right now are the protests in the Far East and the protests in Belarus. How do you view them? Are there signs for change? It's harder to, for instance, I think, to blame the U.S. for the protests in the Far East right now in Russia, like it was easy to do in Ukraine.
Right.
Or are these protests unfortunately going to go the way of previous protests? I mean, is there something substantive to these moments that we might take some hope from?
Very hard question. I don't have a good answer for. I teach courses here at Stanford on revolutions and political change and nonviolent civic resistance and democratization. And I want to say very modestly, before attempting an answer at your question, we're not very good at prediction in the social sciences. I would also say from 5 years in the US government that our intelligence community also is not very good at these predictions, just so you know. These are hard things to get right. So I don't know for sure. I would say they both what's happening in Khabarovsk and Belarus undermine those classic arguments about passivity and Russians don't care about democracy and the Belarusian stereotypes that people have had for decades about the people of Belarus. We're obviously seeing that hundreds of thousands of people care about when their elected leaders in Havighurst are removed or when their votes are stolen in Belarus. And you know, once those things happen, I can't predict what will happen in the short term, but I'm pretty confident in predicting in the long term. There's no going back. You can't put the genie back in after this. In fact, I was just on a call with one of my Russian colleagues. One of the great things of COVID, by the way, most of it's horrible and awful, but we've gotten used to talking like we're talking right now, right? And so I literally in the last 48 hours have been on calls with people from Russia, Belarus, and China within the span of 48 hours, and because we've all gotten used to Zoom. And one of my Russian colleagues, his metaphor was the following. He said, look, he said, I have a very elderly mother. She's been that way. She's been bedridden for 4 or 5 years, he said. She will never recover. We know that. We just don't know when the end of her life will come, but we know that she's never going to walk again. We know that there's not some uptick, some turning around of her condition. And he said that's the condition of the Russian regime today. It's not going to recover. And that was a very powerful metaphor for me. And I think that's true, right? So, you know, Russia and Belarus are, just to go back to my social science background, you know, they're two of the richest, most educated countries in the world that are not democracies. And modernization theory is a bad predictor of when countries democratize. But if you look at it over decades and the last couple of hundreds of years, countries that tend to be more educated and tend to have, you know, GDP per capita is over a certain level and tend to be more urban, tend to be democratic. And I just don't think these regimes can last forever. There's just not an argument in either Russia or Belarus that says, well, you know, let's just stick with this. You know, it's been working for a while, and maybe it's not working so great. Why don't we just stick with this for another 20 years? I think that's very unlikely. So, you know, I can't predict what's going to happen next year. But when somebody asks me what's more likely, will Putinism be around 20 more years from now? And now let's add Lukashenko. Will their regimes and ideologies be in place? I think that's the more radical prediction, to say that they're both going to last another 20 years rather than to suggest there might be something in place.
I agree. That is hopeful. And, you know, it's true, too, that one of the aspects that's fueling both of these protests is the fact that there's an increasingly larger percentage of the population of both countries that have known nothing other than Putinism and Lukashenko.
Yes.
And that will only increase in the future.
Only increase, and the data that we have, which is imperfect, show that those people's attitudes are changing, right? And kids in Russia, I haven't seen the data on Belarus. I'm sure it's the same. They don't watch TV to get their news, right? They're completely disconnected from that world, which is not to say that they're all liberal Democrats either, right? So that's a very interesting juxtaposition, but you know, attitudes, I think, have changed rather radically because the information space that they live in has changed rather radically.
You brought us almost full circle there a moment ago. You said in 20 years, will there be Putinism or a Lukashenko? And you said no. So that's a natural lead into the last question. And that is, we began with 20 years ago in that first conference, and began with the fact at that first conference, and your book, as you described it, that Putin was a new thing. So I'm curious, what's on your reading list, or what should we be reading now that helps explain the last 20 years in Russia?
Interesting. I could go and get all my books behind me. Actually, Karen Dawisha's book is one of the most important books to read about the Putin era. She was ahead of her time, and documented, I think, what I myself got wrong. I want to be honest about this. I wrote a kind of corrective piece not too long ago in Comparative Politics about it, but the two undercurrents of things that were happening over the last 20 years, which was, one, the resurrection of the KGB and the intelligence circles. They were not destroyed, in 1991. They kind of resurrected, and now they're running the country. And then over time, they fused with oligarchic capitalism, right? And corruption. And now many of those KGB people are running the biggest companies in Russia, right? Rosneft is the most iconic illustration of that. So Igor Sechin, by the way, another guy I met in the spring of 1991, and I actually knew him fairly well. He's an intelligence officer, was with Putin throughout all of those years, and now he's the head of Rosneft, the largest energy company in Russia. And that fusion together, understanding that, I think is something that it's hard to understand, right? It's hard to document, and it's hard to do it without getting in trouble in terms of documentation of legalities and things like that. But that is a big, important story. Catherine Belton's new book, I think it's called Putin's People. I'm just trying to look to find it. Yeah, Putin's People. Catherine she's a journalist. I've known her forever. I think I just started to read it. I think, for me, it's a very familiar story, but for those who haven't been following the story, she really captures the piece that I just talked about in terms of bringing those things together. And then just more broadly, I think, this is just my own reading. I was just reading this book, in fact, right before we got on the call. It's a book by Jim Traub called What Was Liberalism? The Past, Present, and Promise of a Noble Idea. And I bring it up because I think we're at a time in our history in the world where liberalism as an idea and illiberalism, it's not just being fought in Russia, it's being fought here in the United States, it's being fought through Europe. The rise of these illiberal regimes, China and Russia being the most important. And I think we got to kind of get back to basics, and 20 years ago, or maybe 30 years ago, my colleague Frank Fukuyama here wrote a very famous essay about the end of history when it felt like liberalism was the only ideology out there. There were no challengers. Now we're in a time where there are real challengers. And I think we kind of lost focus on what our core set of ideas are. And liberalism is with a small L, by the way. You can call it democracy, human rights, whatever you want, but those kind of ideas. And I think we forgot about how other regimes can propagate ideas that undermine those. And things you were mentioning earlier that you study, by the way. We used to spend a lot of time studying film and publications and literature during the Cold War days because we took seriously the propagation of these illiberal ideas as a threat to our way of living. And I think we got out of the habit of doing that. And anything in that kind of grand world of thinking about big ideas again, I think is something tragically that we have to kind of remember those things again, because we are in a more ideological time today than we were 20 years ago, especially with respect to the challenges out there from Russia and China in the first instance.
Excellent advice and well said. Michael McFaul, thank you for joining me today, and thank you for helping us kick off this new series, Reimagining Russia. It's been great catching up. Maybe 20 years from now, we'll revisit what we thought we knew now, but we'll wait for that when that happens.
Okay, thanks a lot for having me. That was really, really great. I appreciated it. And congratulations on 20 years.
Thank
That's
you.
a great achievement.
Thank you.